There are moments in life when you realize that the person you love most in the world sees you as nothing more than an embarrassment. I'm Marina. I'm 55 years old, and 3 days ago I discovered that my own daughter thinks I'm a failure before I even started. I still remember the exact moment when everything changed. I was standing in what would become my little home decor store, holding the keys that represented 27 years of dreams deferred. The space smelled like fresh paint and possibility. Sunlight streamed through the large front window, illuminating dust particles that danced like tiny hopes in the air. For the first time in decades, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I had spent months preparing for this moment. Every evening after my shift at the department store, I would come here and work until my hands bled from assembling shelves and painting walls. I researched suppliers, learned about inventory management, studied social media marketing on YouTube videos until my eyes burned. This wasn't just a whim. This was the dream I had buried when Sophia was born, when being a single mother meant putting everyone else's needs before my own. The grand opening was scheduled for Saturday morning. I had made handwritten invitations, bought fresh flowers, prepared homemade cookies that filled the entire store with the smell of vanilla and cinnamon. I imagined Sophia cutting the ribbon with me, taking photos we could frame and hang on the wall. I imagined her telling her friends, "That's my mom. She's so brave," starting her own business at 55. Instead, when I called to remind her about the opening, her voice turned cold in a way that made my stomach clench with familiar dread. "Mom, I've been thinking about this whole store thing," she said, and I could hear her moving around her apartment, probably getting ready for some social event that was more important than supporting her mother. "Don't you think you're being a little unrealistic?" The word unrealistic hit me like a physical blow. This was the daughter I had raised alone after her father decided we weren't worth staying for. The daughter I had worked double shifts to support, selling my wedding ring to pay for her college tuition while I ate ramen noodles for dinner. The daughter who had never gone without anything she needed, even when I went without everything I wanted. "I don't understand, honey," I said, trying to keep my voice steady while my hands began to shake. "I thought you were excited about the store. You said it sounded like a wonderful opportunity." I was trying to be supportive, but honestly, "It's embarrassing, Mom. You're 55 years old. You should be thinking about retirement, not playing entrepreneur. You'll never succeed at this. These kinds of businesses fail all the time. And then what? You'll lose your savings, maybe even the house." Each word landed with devastating precision, as if she had spent time crafting them for maximum damage. But it was the casual cruelty in her tone that destroyed me. The way she dismissed 27 years of deferred dreams as playing entrepreneur, as if my aspirations were nothing more than childish fantasies that needed to be corrected by someone wiser and more realistic. "I won't be at the opening," she continued, and I could hear her checking her phone, probably responding to messages that were more worthy of her attention than this conversation with her mother. "I have plans, and honestly, I think it's better if I'm not associated with this right now. My career is just starting to take off, and I can't afford to have people thinking my family makes poor financial decisions." The line went quiet, except for the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. My career is just starting to take off, as if mine didn't matter, as if the years I spent supporting her career meant nothing now that she had achieved the success I had made possible. "I understand," I whispered, though I understood nothing except that my own daughter was ashamed of me. After she hung up, I stood in my empty store for hours, surrounded by carefully arranged merchandise that suddenly felt like evidence of my delusions, rather than proof of my determination. The handmade curtains I had sewn with such pride now seemed amateurish. The vintage furniture I had lovingly restored looked shabby rather than charming. Every item I had chosen with such care now reflected back Sophia's judgment. Unrealistic, embarrassing, doomed to fail. If you enjoy stories that touch the heart, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything to our work. And please comment with which city you're watching from. That night, I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the grand opening invitations I had written by hand, each one decorated with small watercolor flowers that had taken me hours to paint. 27 invitations for friends, neighbors, former co-workers, People who might come out of politeness or curiosity, but not the one person whose presence would have made it all meaningful. I thought about calling Sophia back, maybe apologizing for being unrealistic, maybe agreeing that I should abandon this foolish dream and return to the safety of my department store job, where I folded other people's clothes and arranged other people's displays and collected a paycheck that barely covered my modest needs, but never challenged anyone's expectations. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea and sat in the darkness, listening to the old house settle around me like the weight of all my abandoned hopes. Tomorrow was Friday. The grand opening was in 24 hours. And for the first time since I had signed the lease, I wasn't sure I had the strength to unlock the door. The morning of the grand opening arrived gray and drizzling, as if the sky itself had decided to mirror my broken heart. I woke up at 5 a.m. not because I set an alarm, but because sleep had become impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Sophia's voice. "It's embarrassing, Mom. You'll never succeed." I made coffee with trembling hands and sat by the kitchen window, watching my neighbors' houses slowly come to life. Mrs. Patterson walked her little terrier past my window, the same route they took every morning for the past 8 years. The Johnsons backed their minivan out of the driveway, probably rushing their kids to some weekend activity. Normal families doing normal things on what should have been the most important day of my life. My phone sat silent on the kitchen table. Part of me kept hoping Sophia might call, maybe to apologize. Maybe to say she had changed her mind and would be there after all. But as the hours passed, that hope withered like flowers left too long without water. I arrived at the store at 7 a.m., 2 hours before the scheduled opening. The key felt heavy in my hand as I unlocked the door to what suddenly felt more like a mausoleum than a business. The smell of fresh paint and vanilla cookies couldn't mask the overwhelming sense of emptiness that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. I had arranged everything perfectly the night before. The welcome banner hung cheerfully across the entrance. Small bouquets of daisies sat on every display table. The cash register was loaded with change I could barely afford to tie up. Soft jazz played from speakers I had borrowed from my neighbor. Everything was ready for a celebration that might never happen. At 9 a.m. sharp, I turned the sign from closed to open and stood behind the counter, wearing the new dress I had bought specifically for this day, a soft blue that Sophia had once said brought out my eyes. Now it felt like a costume for a play no one wanted to watch. The first hour passed with agonizing slowness. A few people walked by and glanced through the window, but no one entered. I rearranged merchandise that didn't need rearranging. I wiped down surfaces that were already spotless. I checked my phone 17 times, hoping for a message that never came. Around 10:30, my neighbor Carol stopped by. She was one of the people I had invited, a kind woman in her 60s who had always been friendly when we encountered each other at the mailbox or grocery store. She browsed politely, complimented my taste in choosing inventory, and bought a small ceramic vase that cost $12. "It's lovely, Marina," she said as I wrapped her purchase with paper that suddenly seemed too fancy for such a modest sale. "I'm sure once word gets out, you'll have customers lining up." But even Carol's kindness couldn't hide the question I saw in her eyes. "Where is everyone? Where is your family? Where is your daughter?" After Carol left, the silence became suffocating. I called my sister Ruth, thinking maybe family support could fill the void Sophia had created. Ruth lived 3 hours away, and I hadn't expected her to make the drive, but I hoped she might at least offer some encouragement over the phone. "Oh, Marina, I forgot today was your opening day," Ruth said, and I could hear her television in the background, some cooking show that was apparently more engaging than her sister's dreams. "How's it going? Are you busy?" "Not exactly," I admitted, staring at my empty store where the jazz music now sounded more like a funeral dirge than a celebration soundtrack. "Well, these things take time," Ruth said in the same tone she might use to console someone whose pet had died, sympathetic but distant, as if my disappointment was expected and therefore not particularly tragic. "Maybe you started too big. Maybe you should have tested the market first with something smaller, less risky." There it was again. That word. Risk. As if dreaming at 55 was inherently reckless. As if women my age were supposed to accept whatever life had already given them and stop reaching for more. As if the 27 years I had spent raising Sophia, supporting her dreams, Sacrificing my own ambitions had somehow disqualified me from pursuing anything meaningful for myself. "I have to go," I told Ruth. Someone just walked in. No one had walked in, but I couldn't bear to hear another person I loved explain why my dreams were impractical, unrealistic, embarrassing. By noon, I had sold exactly one item to exactly one customer. The cookies I had baked with such hope were going stale on their decorative plates. The flowers were beginning to wilt in the unseasonable warmth that had burned away the morning's gray clouds. I sat behind the counter and watched people walk past my window, some slowing to look, most not even noticing the woman inside who had bet everything on a dream that was dying in real time. That's when I saw her, Sophia's friend Jessica, walking past with two other young women I didn't recognize. They stopped directly in front of my window, and I could see Jessica pointing and talking animatedly to her companions. They all turned to stare at me sitting alone behind my counter, and then they laughed. Not polite laughter, not even uncomfortable laughter. They laughed the way people laugh at something genuinely amusing, something worth sharing and remembering. I watched Jessica pull out her phone and take a picture of my store, probably to text to Sophia with some caption about poor deluded Marina and her pathetic little shop that no one wanted to visit. The humiliation was so complete, so devastating, that I actually felt dizzy. These were girls I had known since they were teenagers. Girls I had driven to movies and bought pizza for when they hung around my house during Sophia's high school years. Girls who had called me Mrs. Emin thanked me for letting them stay over during sleepovers where they painted their nails and gossiped about boys and planned their futures with the casual confidence of people who had never doubted they deserved good things. Now they saw me as entertainment, as proof that some people simply didn't know their place in the world. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe, tried to find some reserve of dignity that hadn't been stripped away by this endless parade of disappointments. When I opened them, the girls were gone, but their laughter seemed to echo in the empty space around me like ghosts of my former confidence. The afternoon brought two more customers, an elderly man who bought a small picture frame for his wife, and a mother with twin toddlers who purchased a decorative candle while her children knocked over my carefully arranged display of silk flowers. I spent 20 minutes after they left trying to restore order to what had taken me hours to create. As evening approached and the reality of my situation became undeniable, I began to understand that this wasn't just about a failed business opening. This was about the complete dissolution of the relationship I had treasured most in my life. Sophia hadn't just refused to support my dream. She had actively discouraged me from pursuing it, then abandoned me when I refused to give up. The daughter I had raised to be strong and independent had used that strength to crush her mother's spirit. The child I had taught to believe in herself had decided her mother was unworthy of the same faith. At closing time, I counted my receipts. $43.57 in sales. After expenses, I had lost nearly $300 on what was supposed to be the beginning of my new life. 3 weeks after the grand opening, I was still trying to prove Sophia wrong, still believing that if I could just show her some success, some validation from the outside world, she might remember that she was supposed to love me unconditionally. I threw myself into the business with desperate energy, staying at the store until 9 p.m. every night, researching marketing strategies on my laptop until my eyes burned, posting photos on social media accounts I barely understood how to use. I learned about hashtags and target demographics and customer engagement metrics, all while pretending that my heart wasn't breaking a little more each day. Sophia's silence continued. The store was slowly gaining traction, nothing dramatic, but steady. Mrs. Chen from the flower shop next door sent customers my way. A few interior design bloggers had featured some of my vintage pieces on their Instagram accounts. I was averaging about 15 customers a day and actually turning a tiny profit. It wasn't the overnight success Sophia had said was impossible, but it was something. It was proof that maybe, just maybe, her mother wasn't as unrealistic as she believed. I documented everything, taking photos of happy customers, screenshot of positive online reviews, pictures of my growing inventory. I was building a case for my own worth, collecting evidence that I could present to my daughter like a defendant hoping for acquittal. The opportunity came when Sophia finally called, not to apologize, but to inform me she was bringing her new boyfriend to Sunday dinner. David was apparently someone important from her marketing firm, someone she wanted to impress, someone whose opinion mattered more than mine ever would. "I hope you don't mind, but could we do something simple?" she said, her voice carrying that familiar tone she used when asking for favors she expected to be granted without question. David is very sophisticated. He's traveled all over Europe. He knows about wine and art and things like that. Maybe we could just order from that Italian place you like instead of you cooking? Even now, she was protecting this stranger from my inadequacies, assuming that a home-cooked meal prepared by her mother wouldn't meet his standards. But I saw this as my chance. My opportunity to show Sophia that I wasn't the embarrassing failure she believed me to be. "Actually, honey, I was hoping you both might want to stop by the store first," I said, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "Business has been picking up, and I've got some beautiful new pieces I think David might appreciate. I know you said he has good taste." The pause on the other end of the line lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. "Mom," Sophia said finally, and the word carried years of accumulated disappointment. "I told you I can't be associated with that right now. My career is in a very delicate place. David works with major retail brands. If he sees me connected to some little amateur shop, it could damage my professional reputation." Amateur shop. The words hit me like a slap across the face. This was the business I had poured my savings, my time, my dreams into. The space where I arrived every morning at 7 a.m. and stayed until my feet ached from standing on concrete floors. The inventory I had chosen piece by piece, often driving hours to estate sales and antique markets, using knowledge I had accumulated over decades of loving, beautiful things I could never afford to own. "Sophia, please," I whispered, and I could hear the pathetic pleading in my own voice. "Just 5 minutes. I'm not asking you to post about it on social media or tell your friends. I just want you to see what I've accomplished. I want you to be proud of me." "I can't, Mom. I'm sorry, but I just can't." That Sunday, I cooked for 3 hours. I made Sophia's favorite lasagna from scratch, the same recipe I had perfected over years of birthday dinners and celebration meals. I set the table with the good china I rarely used, lit candles, bought wine that cost more than my daily food budget. I even wore the pearls she had given me for Mother's Day 3 years ago, back when she still pretended to think I deserved nice things. David turned out to be exactly what I had expected. Handsome in a generic way, confident with the casual arrogance of someone who had never doubted his place in the world, politely condescending in the manner of people who believed their tolerance of lesser beings demonstrated their good character. He complimented the meal with the kind of surprised approval that made it clear he hadn't expected competence from someone like me. "This is actually very good, Mrs. Morrison," he said, as if my ability to cook lasagna was a remarkable achievement worthy of patronizing praise. Sophia beamed at his approval, more excited by this stranger's validation of her mother's cooking than she had ever been by any accomplishment of mine. She hung on his every word as he told stories about his European business trips, his weekend house in the Hamptons, his connections to celebrities I had never heard of, but was apparently supposed to be impressed by. I sat at my own dinner table and watched my daughter transform herself into whoever she thought David wanted her to be, more sophisticated, more worldly, more embarrassed by the suburban house where she had grown up and the woman who had raised her. When David excused himself to use the bathroom, I saw my opening. "Honey," I said quietly, reaching across the table to touch Sophia's hand. "I know you're worried about the store affecting your career, but things are really turning around. Yesterday I had my biggest sales day yet, and there's a local magazine that wants to do a feature story. Maybe after dinner you could just drive by and see how nice everything looks with the new window display." Sophia pulled her hand away as if I had burned her. "Mom, please stop," she hissed, glancing toward the hallway where David's footsteps could be heard approaching. "You're being obsessive about this. It's weird and desperate, and it's making me uncomfortable. Can't you just let it go?" Obsessive, weird, desperate. These were the words my daughter used to describe my passion, my dreams, my refusal to accept that women my age were supposed to fade quietly into the background of their children's more important lives. David returned to the table, and the conversation resumed its previous trajectory of his accomplishments and Sophia's adoring responses. I served dessert and coffee and smiled and nodded at appropriate intervals, while feeling like a ghost haunting my own dinner party. As they were leaving, David shook my hand with the firm grip he probably used on business associates he would never see again. "Thank you for dinner, Mrs. Morrison. Sophia is lucky to have such a dedicated mother." The pause before dedicated spoke volumes. He had clearly been briefed about my little shop and my inappropriate ambitions, warned that Sophia's mother was going through some kind of midlife crisis that required careful management and gentle tolerance. After they left, I stood in my kitchen surrounded by dirty dishes and the lingering smell of expensive wine, finally understanding that I had been fighting a battle I could never win. Sophia wasn't ashamed of my failure. She was ashamed of my trying. She didn't want me to succeed because my success would complicate the narrative she had constructed about who we were supposed to be in relation to each other. I was supposed to be grateful for her visits, thrilled by her career achievements, content to live vicariously through her successes while contributing nothing meaningful to the world myself. I was supposed to be a supporting character in her story, not the protagonist of my own. That night, I lay awake thinking about all the times over the years when I had made myself smaller to make Sophia feel bigger. All the times I had hidden my own interests, postponed my own plans, diminished my own dreams so she could shine brighter by comparison. I had taught her that mothers were supposed to sacrifice everything for their children, and she had learned that lesson too well. She expected my continued sacrifice not as a gift freely given, but as an obligation I owed her simply by virtue of having brought her into the world. The next morning, I opened the store as usual, but something fundamental had shifted inside me. I was tired of apologizing for wanting more than the life other people thought I deserved. I was tired of seeking permission to dream from people who benefited from my smallness. For the first time since Sophia's phone call 3 weeks ago, I stopped checking my messages every 5 minutes. Stopped hoping for her approval, stopped trying to prove I was worthy of her love. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. 2 months passed without a single word from Sophia. Not a text, not a call, not even a response to the birthday card I sent for her 28th birthday. A card I spent an hour selecting, choosing one with a simple, "thinking of you" message instead of anything that might mention love or family, or the complicated history between us. I stopped mentioning her to customers who asked about my family. When Mrs. Patterson from down the street inquired about how Sophia was doing, I learned to smile and say, "Oh, she's very busy with her career," as if distance was a natural consequence of success rather than a deliberate choice to exclude me from her life. The store was doing well. Better than well, actually. Word of mouth had brought steady customers, and I had been featured in 2 local publications as a hidden gem for vintage home decor. My Instagram account had grown to over 1,000 followers, mostly women my age who appreciated the careful curation and personal stories I shared about each piece in my collection. But success felt hollow when the person whose opinion mattered most had made it clear she would never celebrate it with me. Every positive review, every new customer, every small milestone felt like speaking into a void where my daughter's voice should have been. I found myself standing in the store after hours, surrounded by beautiful things that other people's children might inherit someday, wondering what would happen to all of this when I was gone. Who would remember the stories behind each piece? Who would understand why I had chosen this particular mirror from an estate sale in Connecticut, or that vintage serving tray that reminded me of Sunday dinners at my grandmother's house? The loneliness wasn't just about missing Sophia, it was about realizing that I had built my entire identity around being her mother, and now that she had decided she didn't need me, I wasn't sure who I was supposed to be. One evening in late October, I was closing up when I found myself staring at a photograph on my desk. Sophia at her college graduation, beaming in her cap and gown while I stood beside her with my arm around her waist, both of us squinting in the bright sunshine. We looked happy. We looked like people who loved each other unconditionally. I picked up the frame and studied our faces, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when everything had changed, when my pride in her accomplishments had transformed into shame about my own aspirations. When had I become an embarrassment rather than an inspiration? When had my dreams become evidence of my inadequacy rather than proof of my resilience? I couldn't remember, and that felt like the deepest failure of all. That I had been so focused on making Sophia happy that I hadn't noticed when she stopped wanting me to be happy too. That night I called her, not to apologize or beg for reconciliation, but because I needed to understand. I needed to hear her explain when exactly I had forfeited the right to her respect, when loving her had become insufficient qualification for her love in return. She answered on the fourth ring, her voice distant and professionally polite. "Hi, Mom. Sophia, I need to ask you something," I said, settling into my kitchen chair with the phone pressed against my ear like a lifeline. "When did you decide you were ashamed of me?" The silence stretched so long I thought she had hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled, as if she had prepared for this conversation and rehearsed her responses. "I'm not ashamed of you, Mom. I just think you're going through some kind of midlife crisis that's making you behave in ways that are difficult for me to support." Midlife crisis. As if wanting more from life at 55 was a psychological disorder rather than a natural human impulse. As if the years I had spent supporting her dreams had somehow disqualified me from pursuing my own. "I raised you to believe you could do anything," I said, and my voice cracked despite my efforts to remain composed. "I worked 2 jobs to pay for your education. I sold my wedding ring to cover your senior year tuition when your father stopped sending support. I never once told you that your dreams were unrealistic or embarrassing or inappropriate for someone your age." "That's different," Sophia said quickly. "I was young. I had potential. You had already made your choices. You chose to have me. You chose to be a single mother. You chose to work retail. Those choices have consequences." The words hit me like physical blows, each one landing with devastating precision. She had reduced my entire life to a series of choices that had apparently disqualified me from making new ones. Having her had been a choice that limited my options forever. Being abandoned by her father was somehow my fault. Working retail to support her dreams had marked me as permanently unsuitable for anything better. "So I'm just supposed to accept that this is all I get?" I whispered. "One daughter who can't be bothered to visit, a job I already quit to pursue this dream, and whatever small life you think is appropriate for someone like me?" "Mom, you're being dramatic," Sophia said, and I could hear her moving around her apartment, probably multitasking during this conversation about my broken heart. "You have the store, you have your customers, you have a perfectly nice life for someone in your situation." Someone in your situation. The phrase echoed in my mind long after she hung up. Not rudely, but with the efficient finality of someone ending a business call that had run longer than scheduled. I was someone in a situation, not a person with dreams and feelings, and the same fundamental human right to growth and change that she claimed for herself. I sat in my dark kitchen for hours that night, staring at the photograph of us at her graduation, while her words replayed in an endless loop. "You chose to have me. You chose to be a single mother. Those choices have consequences." The cruelest part was that she was right. I had chosen her. I had chosen to raise her alone when her father decided we weren't worth his time. I had chosen to sacrifice my own ambitions to ensure she had every opportunity I had never received. But I had made those choices out of love, believing that love was a foundation strong enough to build a lifetime of mutual support and respect upon. I had been wrong. The next morning, I almost didn't open the store. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes, staring at the cheerful sign I had painted by hand, wondering what the point was of building something beautiful if the person you loved most in the world would always see it as evidence of your delusions rather than proof of your capabilities. But somewhere between the despair and the resignation, I found something I hadn't expected to discover. It wasn't hope exactly. Hope required believing that things might get better, that relationships might heal, that daughters might remember they were supposed to love their mothers. What I found was smaller but somehow stronger, the quiet recognition that I still had something left to give, even if Sophia would never receive it. I had built something, not for her, but despite her doubts, not with her support, but in the face of her opposition. The store existed not because she believed in me, but because I had learned to believe in myself, even when the person whose opinion mattered most had decided I wasn't worth believing in. I unlocked the door and turned on the lights, watching the morning sun illuminate displays I had arranged with care and knowledge accumulated over decades of loving, beautiful things. This was mine. These stories were mine. This dream was mine, regardless of whether anyone else understood its value. For the first time since Sophia's graduation day, I looked around my space and felt proud of what I had accomplished rather than defensive about what others might think of it. It wasn't much, but it was something. And maybe, for a woman in my situation, something was enough. Something changed in me the morning I stopped checking my phone for messages that would never come. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No lightning bolt of realization or sudden burst of confidence. It was more like finally setting down a heavy bag I had been carrying for so long, I had forgotten how much it weighed. I was arranging a new shipment of vintage linens when I found myself humming, while I worked. The melody was something my grandmother used to sing while she did housework, a simple tune that spoke of contentment rather than joy, of peace rather than happiness. I hadn't hummed in months, hadn't even realized how silent my days had become until the music returned on its own. The store had developed its own rhythm, its own personality that had nothing to do with proving anything to anyone. Regular customers had become friends. Mrs. Chen from the flower shop next door brought me tea every Tuesday afternoon. A young couple renovating their first home consulted me weekly about their decorating choices, trusting my eye and experience in ways that felt genuinely meaningful. Most importantly, I had stopped explaining myself. When new customers asked about my background, I no longer felt compelled to justify my transition from retail work to business ownership. I simply shared my knowledge about antiques and design, offered honest advice about their purchases, and let my expertise speak for itself. It was during one of these conversations that I met Eleanor Williams, a woman in her 70s who walked with a silver-headed cane and spoke with the authority of someone who had lived through enough disappointments to recognize authentic resilience when she saw it. Eleanor had been browsing my collection of vintage jewelry when she paused at a particular brooch, an Art Deco piece with intricate silver work and a small but perfect sapphire at its center. "This is exceptional," she said, examining the piece with the trained eye of someone who understood craftsmanship. "Where did you find it?" I told her the story, how I had discovered it at an estate sale in a wealthy suburb, tucked away in a jewelry box that the deceased woman's children were selling without examining its contents. How I had recognized its value not just financially, but historically, artistically. How I had researched its provenance and discovered it was the work of a famous Art Deco designer from the 1920s. Eleanor listened with the kind of attention I hadn't received from anyone in my family for years. Genuine interest, respect for my knowledge, appreciation for the care I had taken with this small piece of history. "You have an excellent eye," she said finally. "How long have you been in this business?" "About 4 months," I admitted, then waited for the familiar response. Surprised that someone so new could have acquired such knowledge, doubt about my credibility, polite encouragement tinged with condescension. Instead, Eleanor smiled. "Natural talent. You can't teach that kind of intuition. I should know. I owned galleries in Manhattan for 30 years before retiring here." She bought the brooch, but more importantly, she invited me to coffee the following week. During that conversation, she shared her own story of starting over at an age when most people expected her to scale down, rather than expand her ambitions. Her first gallery had opened when she was 45, after her children were grown, and her marriage had ended in a civilized but devastating divorce. "People told me I was too old to start in such a competitive field," Eleanor said, stirring sugar into her coffee with the precise movements of someone who had learned to savor small pleasures. "They said the art world was for young people, that I couldn't possibly understand contemporary trends or build the kind of relationships necessary for success." "What did you do?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "I ignored them," she said simply. "I studied everything I could get my hands on. I traveled to galleries in Europe, spent months learning from dealers who had been in the business for decades. I worked harder than people half my age because I had to prove not just that I was good, but that I belonged." She had built something extraordinary, not just financially successful galleries, but institutions that had launched the careers of artists who were now showing in major museums. She had done it despite the skepticism of people who believed women her age should be content with volunteer work and grandchildren. "The thing about starting later in life," Eleanor continued, "is that you bring wisdom and perspective that younger people simply don't possess. You've lived through enough to recognize what matters and what doesn't. You're not distracted by the need to impress people or fit into social circles. You're free to focus purely on the work itself. As she spoke, I felt something shifting inside me. Not the desperate hope I had clung to during those early months when I still believed Sophia might change her mind, but something steadier and more sustaining. Recognition, perhaps. Understanding that my path was not unique, that other women had walked similar roads and survived, even thrived. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since before Sophia's cruel phone call. I called my sister Ruth, not to seek comfort or validation, but to share good news simply because I was proud of it and wanted to tell someone who had known me since childhood. The store featured me in their newsletter, I told her, referring to the Antique Dealers Association I had recently joined. They called me a rising star in vintage home decor. Can you believe that? Me, a rising star at 55. Ruth's response was exactly what I expected. That's nice, Marina. I hope it doesn't go to your head. A few months ago, that comment would have deflated me completely, would have sent me spiraling into self-doubt and apologies for daring to feel proud of my accomplishments. Now, I simply laughed. It might, I said. I might let it go straight to my head and start believing I'm actually good at something. The silence on Ruth's end of the line told me she didn't know how to respond to this version of her sister, the one who wasn't seeking permission to feel proud, who wasn't apologizing for taking up space in the world. After I hung up, I realized I had passed some invisible test I hadn't even known I was taking. I no longer needed other people's approval to validate my choices. I no longer needed Sophia's love to prove I was lovable. I no longer needed anyone's permission to believe in myself. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done since the devastating grand opening. I took pictures of my thriving store and posted them online with a caption that felt revolutionary in its simplicity. 4 months in, and I couldn't be happier with this new chapter. Sometimes the best time to plant a tree is not 20 years ago, but right now. Within hours, the post had dozens of comments from women sharing their own stories of starting over, of pursuing dreams they had deferred, of discovering strength they hadn't known they possessed. Some were my age, some older, some younger, but all of them understood something that Sophia apparently didn't, that growth doesn't have an expiration date, that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. Among the comments was one from a username I didn't recognize. Proud of you, Mom. I've been following your posts for weeks. We need to talk. My hands shook as I stared at those words, reading them over and over to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Sophia had been watching. Sophia had been following my journey even while maintaining her public distance. Sophia was ready to talk. But for the first time since this whole ordeal began, I wasn't ready to drop everything and rush toward her voice. I had learned something valuable during these months of silence. My worth wasn't determined by her approval, and my happiness wasn't dependent on her participation in my life. I would call her back, but on my terms, when I was ready, from a position of strength rather than desperation. It wasn't revenge, it was self-respect, and it felt like the most radical act of my entire 55 years. I let 3 days pass before responding to Sophia's comment. 3 days during which I went about my business with a calmness that surprised me. Serving customers, arranging new displays, meeting with Eleanor for our weekly coffee conversations about art and resilience, and the particular satisfaction of proving skeptics wrong. I wasn't ignoring Sophia's message out of spite. I was simply no longer operating from a place of desperate hunger for her attention. For the first time in our relationship, I had something she wanted. My time, my forgiveness, my willingness to pretend the past few months hadn't happened, and she would have to wait for it just as I had waited for her. On Thursday afternoon, while I was helping a young mother choose curtains for her baby's nursery, my phone rang. Sophia's name appeared on the screen, and I felt my stomach clench with the old familiar anxiety. But instead of dropping everything to answer, I let it go to voicemail and continued my conversation about color coordination and light filtering fabrics. The customer, her name was Jennifer, and this was her first baby, had been coming in weekly for the past month, slowly gathering pieces for what she called her dream nursery. She had a modest budget and had been saving for months to create something beautiful for the child she had tried for years to conceive. I want it to be perfect, she told me. running her fingers over a soft yellow fabric that would coordinate beautifully with the vintage rocking chair she had purchased the week before. I want my daughter to grow up surrounded by beautiful things, to understand that she deserves good things even if we can't afford the expensive versions. As I helped her calculate measurements and discussed installation options, I found myself thinking about the parallels to my own journey. Here was another woman investing her limited resources in something that mattered to her, something that others might dismiss as frivolous or unnecessary. Another woman who understood that creating beauty wasn't vanity. It was an act of faith in the future, a declaration that hope deserved physical manifestation. After Jennifer left with her carefully wrapped purchases and a smile that lit up her entire face, I finally listened to Sophia's voicemail. "Mom, I know you saw my comment," her recorded voice said, and I could hear something new in her tone, uncertainty, perhaps even anxiety. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation, about the things I said. Maybe I was too harsh. Could we meet somewhere and talk? I could come to the store if you want. I think we need to clear the air." The old Marina would have called back immediately, would have arranged to meet that very evening, would have spent hours preparing apologies for whatever crimes I had committed by daring to pursue happiness without her permission. The new Marina, the woman who had learned to hum while she worked, who had built something meaningful despite rather than because of family support, made herself a cup of tea and considered her options with the deliberate care of someone who had finally learned her own worth. I called Eleanor instead. "She wants to meet," I told my mentor, settling into my favorite chair in the store's back room where I handled paperwork and phone calls away from customer interruptions. After months of silence, after telling me I was embarrassing and obsessive and having a midlife crisis, now she wants to talk. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, and I could hear the soft classical music she always played in her apartment in the background of our call. "What do you want?" she asked finally. "Not what you think you should want. Not what would make her happy or resolve the conflict most quickly. What do you actually want from this conversation?" The question caught me off guard because I hadn't considered that my desires might be relevant to the equation. For so many years, managing my relationship with Sophia had meant figuring out what she needed and providing it, regardless of my own emotional state or personal preferences. "I want her to see me," I said finally. "Really see me. Not as an embarrassment to be managed or a midlife crisis to be endured, but as a person who has accomplished something meaningful. I want her to understand that I'm not some pathetic woman clinging to impossible dreams. I'm someone who identified a goal and achieved it, despite everyone telling me it was unrealistic." "And if she can't do that?" Eleanor asked gently. "If she's still not capable of seeing you as anything other than an extension of her own needs and insecurities?" The question forced me to confront a possibility I had been avoiding, that Sophia's cruelty wasn't a temporary lapse in judgment that could be corrected with the right conversation, but a fundamental aspect of how she viewed our relationship, that perhaps she had always seen me as a supporting character in her story, rather than the protagonist of my own. "Then I'll know where I stand," I said, and the words felt both terrifying and liberating. "And I'll stop trying to convince her I'm worthy of her respect." That evening, I composed my response to Sophia's voicemail. I wrote and rewrote it several times, editing out desperation and apologies, adding backbone and dignity. "Sophia, I received your message. I'm willing to meet, but it will be at the store during business hours. I'm there Tuesday through Saturday, 10 to 6. You're welcome to visit any time during those hours, but I won't be closing early or rearranging my schedule. This is my business, and I run it professionally. If you'd like to see what I've built, you know where to find me." I sent the message before I could second-guess myself, then turned off my phone and spent the evening reading a book Eleanor had recommended about women entrepreneurs throughout history. The stories of women who had started businesses in their 50s, 60s, even 70s, who had faced skepticism and discrimination and family disapproval, but had persevered because they understood something their critics didn't, that passion and determination don't have expiration dates. Sophia didn't respond to my message for 2 days, and when she did, it was with a single word: Saturday. I spent the week preparing, but not in the way I might have months earlier. I didn't frantically clean displays that were already spotless or rehearse explanations for my choices. Instead, I simply continued the work I had been doing all along, curating beautiful objects, sharing their stories with customers who appreciated them, building something that reflected my taste and knowledge and vision. On Friday afternoon, a local television reporter came by to interview me for a segment about small businesses owned by women over 50. The producer had seen my social media posts and been impressed by the story of someone who had started over at an age when many people were thinking about retirement. As the camera rolled, I found myself speaking with confidence I hadn't known I possessed about the research that went into each purchase, the relationships I had built with customers, the satisfaction of connecting people with objects that would bring beauty into their daily lives. What advice would you give to other women who might be considering a major life change later in their careers? The reporter asked. Don't wait for permission, I said, looking directly into the camera. Don't wait for other people to believe in your vision. Don't wait for the perfect moment or the ideal circumstances. If you have something to give to the world, give it. The world needs what you have to offer, regardless of what anyone else thinks about your qualifications or your timing. After the crew left, I sat in my store surrounded by the afternoon light that filtered through windows I had cleaned and decorated, taking inventory of everything I had accomplished in 8 months of work. The financial records showed steady growth. The customer testimonials spoke of satisfaction and loyalty. The media attention proved that what I had built was worthy of public recognition and respect. Tomorrow, Sophia would walk through my door for the first time since I had opened. She would see with her own eyes what her embarrassing mother had accomplished. She would witness the customers who sought my advice, the inventory that reflected years of accumulated knowledge, the business that had grown from her dismissal into something substantial and successful. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't angry. I wasn't desperate for her approval or braced for her criticism. I was ready to show her who I had become, ready to demonstrate what I had learned about my own capabilities, ready to have a conversation between equals rather than a daughter managing her mother's inappropriate ambitions. For the first time in our complicated relationship, I would be meeting Sophia from a position of strength rather than need. And whatever happened next, I would handle it with the dignity and self-respect I had finally learned to give myself. Saturday arrived gray and crisp, with the kind of autumn light that made everything look sharper, more defined. I opened the store at exactly 10 a.m., following my usual routine, turning on the soft jazz, adjusting the window display, checking that every surface gleamed with the care I had learned to lavish on my space. I had no idea when Sophia might arrive, so I simply went about my business as if it were any other Saturday. Mrs. Chen stopped by with her weekly offering of jasmine tea. A regular customer named Robert browsed the vintage book collection I had started curating. A young couple spent an hour selecting pieces for their first apartment together, their excitement infectious as they imagined how each item would look in their new home. It was during this last consultation, while I was explaining the history of a particular Art Deco lamp to the enthusiastic couple, that I saw her through the window. Sophia stood on the sidewalk outside my store, staring at the exterior I had painted and decorated with such care. She looked smaller than I remembered, more hesitant, as if she were approaching something that might bite. The couple completed their purchase and left with promises to return the following weekend for additional pieces. Robert selected 2 vintage novels and complimented me on my expanding literary collection. Mrs. Chen waved goodbye and headed back to her flower shop next door. And then it was just me, alone in my space, waiting for my daughter to find the courage to walk through the door she had once dismissed as an embarrassment. When Sophia finally entered, I was arranging a new shipment of vintage glassware, each piece catching the afternoon light in ways that created small rainbows across the display table. I looked up from my work and offered her the same professional smile I gave to any customer entering my store. "Good afternoon," I said, as if she were a stranger rather than the person who had occupied my thoughts and shaped my decisions for 28 years. "Please feel free to look around. Let me know if you have any questions." Sophia stopped just inside the doorway, her eyes moving across displays I had arranged with knowledge accumulated over decades of appreciating beautiful things. I watched her take in the carefully curated collections, the tasteful lighting, the way each section flowed naturally into the next. This was not the amateur shop she had imagined, not the embarrassing vanity project she had expected to find. "Mom," she said finally, and her voice carried a note I hadn't heard in years, something that might have been respect, or perhaps simply surprise. "It's Marina," I corrected gently, continuing to arrange glassware with steady hands. "During business hours, I prefer to keep things professional." The correction landed like a small earthquake in the space between us. For Sophia's entire life, I had been available to her without boundaries, without the protective barriers that other adults maintained between their personal and professional identities. I had never required her to respect my time, my space, or my authority in any domain. She moved deeper into the store, her designer handbag clutched against her chest like armor, her expensive shoes clicking on the hardwood floors I had refinished myself. I could see her cataloging details, the quality of my inventory, the sophistication of my displays, the evidence that this was not a desperate woman's midlife crisis, but a knowledgeable professional's carefully planned venture. "This is," she began, then stopped, apparently struggling to find words that wouldn't contradict everything she had said about my unrealistic ambitions. "Successful," I supplied, setting down the piece of glassware I had been examining and giving her my full attention for the first time since she entered. "The word you're looking for is successful. Featured in 2 magazines, profitable since month 3, growing customer base, media attention. All the markers you use to measure whether something is worth taking seriously." Sophia flinched at the directness of my response, at the absence of the apologetic tone she had grown accustomed to hearing from me whenever we discussed my choices or aspirations. "I saw the TV interview," she said quietly. "Someone at work mentioned it. They said you seemed very professional, very knowledgeable." "I am professional and knowledgeable," I replied. "I've been studying antiques and design for 30 years, even while working retail and raising a daughter who apparently never noticed her mother's interests or expertise." The silence that followed was thick with years of accumulated misunderstandings and unspoken resentments. Sophia walked to a display of vintage jewelry and pretended to examine pieces while I continued my inventory work, neither of us willing to be the first to address the elephant in the room, the months of cruel dismissal, the family dinner where she had called me obsessive and weird, the phone call where she had reduced my dreams to evidence of psychological instability. Finally, she turned to face me, and I saw something in her expression I hadn't expected. Shame. "I was wrong," she said, the words coming out in a rush as if she had been holding them back with considerable effort. "About the store, about your chances of success, about everything I said that night on the phone." I set down my clipboard and looked at her fully, this young woman I had raised to be strong and independent, who had used that strength to try to diminish her mother's dreams. "Which part were you wrong about specifically?" I asked, not to be cruel, but because I needed to hear her acknowledge the scope of the damage she had caused. "The part where you called my business embarrassing? The part where you said I was having a midlife crisis? The part where you told me I should just accept my situation and stop trying to grow beyond it?" Sophia's face reddened, but she maintained eye contact. "All of it. I was wrong about all of it." "Why?" I asked. "What changed? My business is the same as it was 6 months ago when you refused to attend the grand opening. My dreams are the same as they were when you called them unrealistic and inappropriate for someone my age. The only difference is that now other people are telling you it's successful, so suddenly you can see what was always there." The accusation hung between us like a bridge neither of us wanted to cross. Sophia's chin trembled slightly, and for a moment she looked like the little girl who used to come to me with skinned knees and broken hearts, seeking comfort and reassurance that everything would be okay. "You're right," she whispered. "I couldn't see it because I was so worried about what other people would think of me if my mother failed. I was protecting myself instead of supporting you." It was the most honest thing she had said to me in years, and it hit harder than all her previous cruelty, because it revealed the selfishness that had driven every dismissive comment and rejection. "Do you understand what that did to me?" I asked, my voice remaining steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. "I spent 18 years teaching you to believe in yourself, and when I finally asked for the same support in return, you decided my dreams were too risky for your reputation." Sophia's tears started then, not the manipulative crying she had used as a teenager to avoid consequences, but the genuine grief of someone finally understanding the extent of their own cruelty. I know, she said. I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Mom. I was scared and selfish, and I treated you terribly. I don't know how to fix it. I studied her face, this daughter I had loved through every stage of her development, even the stages that had hurt me deeply. She was 28 years old, successful in her chosen career, living independently in a city that challenged and excited her. She was exactly who I had raised her to be, confident, ambitious, uncompromising in her pursuit of her goals. The problem had never been her strength. The problem had been her inability to recognize that the same qualities she valued in herself might be equally valid in her mother. You can't fix it, I said finally. You can't undo months of making me feel ashamed for wanting more from life. You can't take back the grand opening you missed, or the phone calls you ignored, or the way you made me question my own judgment every single day. Sophia's face crumpled, and I felt the familiar maternal instinct to comfort her, to minimize the pain I was causing, to make everything okay again regardless of my own wounds. But I didn't. For the first time in her life, I let Sophia experience the full weight of consequences for choices that had hurt someone she was supposed to love unconditionally. But, I continued, and saw hope flicker in her eyes, you can decide what kind of relationship we have going forward. You can choose to see me as a person with my own dreams and goals and accomplishments, or you can continue to see me as an extension of your needs and insecurities. You can learn to respect the woman who raised you, or you can keep treating her like an embarrassment to be managed. Sophia nodded through her tears, understanding finally that she was being offered not forgiveness, but opportunity, the chance to build something new and better with the woman she had almost lost through her own selfishness and fear. I want to learn, she said. I want to try to be the daughter you deserved all along. 6 months later, I stood behind the counter of my expanded store, watching Sophia carefully arrange a new display of vintage scarves, while she explained their historical significance to a customer who hung on every word. The irony wasn't lost on me. My daughter, who had once been ashamed to be associated with my amateur shop, was now working part-time as my assistant, learning about antiques and design with the same intensity she had once applied to dismissing my dreams. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Those first weeks after our confrontation were awkward, filled with tentative conversations and careful apologies, as Sophia learned to see me as someone whose time and expertise had value beyond their utility to her own life. She had to unlearn 28 years of treating me as an extension of her needs, rather than a person with independent worth and accomplishments. But she was learning, slowly, genuinely, with the same determination she had always brought to challenges that mattered to her. The difference was that now, apparently, I mattered to her too. The beating on this piece is exceptional, Sophia was telling the customer, a middle-aged woman who had driven an hour to see our collection. My mother, who owns the store, taught me that this particular technique was popular in the 1920s, but required incredible skill to execute properly. You can tell this was made by someone who really understood their craft. My mother, who owns the store. The phrase still gave me a small thrill every time I heard it. Not embarrassment at being associated with me, not reluctant acknowledgement of my existence, but genuine pride in what I had built and accomplished. The customer purchased 3 scarves and a vintage hat pin, gushing about how knowledgeable we both were and how rare it was to find a shop where the owners truly understood their inventory. After she left, Sophia turned to me with a smile that reminded me of the little girl who used to help me sort buttons from my sewing basket. I love this part, she said, straightening the display with the same care I had taught her to apply to everything worth doing well. I love that we're preserving these stories, helping people connect with beautiful things that might otherwise be forgotten. We, the word that had been absent from our relationship for so many months. We were working together now, learning from each other, building something meaningful that belonged to both of us in different ways. The afternoon brought Eleanor for her weekly visit, and I watched with quiet satisfaction as she and Sophia discussed a new acquisition, a collection of Art Deco pottery that had required considerable research to authenticate and price appropriately. Eleanor had become something of a mentor to Sophia as well, sharing stories about the art world and the particular challenges faced by women in business. Your mother has built something remarkable here, Eleanor told Sophia, examining a particularly fine piece of the new pottery. I've been in this business for 40 years, and I can recognize genuine expertise when I see it. She has an eye that can't be taught, and a work ethic that would shame people half her age. Sophia beamed at the compliment, not because it reflected well on her, but because someone she respected was acknowledging what she had finally learned to see for herself, that her mother was genuinely gifted at something meaningful, genuinely deserving of recognition and respect. That evening, after we had closed the store and were tallying the day's surprisingly robust sales, Sophia asked if she could take me to dinner. Not because she needed something or wanted to apologize again, but simply because she wanted to spend time with me, to continue a conversation we had started about expanding into online sales. We went to a small Italian restaurant I had never been able to afford during my retail days, the kind of place with cloth napkins and wine lists that had once seemed impossibly sophisticated. Sophia ordered a bottle of wine that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget used to be, but I no longer felt self-conscious about accepting nice things from my daughter. I had earned her respect, and with it, the right to be treated as someone whose comfort and enjoyment mattered. "I've been thinking about what you said," Sophia said, twirling pasta around her fork with the same precision she brought to arranging displays. "About the online expansion. I think you're right that there's a whole market of people who would love your pieces but can't physically get to the store. Your marketing background would be invaluable for that kind of project," I replied, and saw her face light up at the recognition of her professional skills. "I understand beautiful objects and their histories, but you understand how to reach the people who would love them." "Ah?" We spent 2 hours planning a website launch, discussing photography techniques for showcasing antiques online, debating social media strategies that would highlight the stories behind each piece rather than just their retail prices. It was the kind of collaborative conversation I had dreamed of having with Sophia for years, two adults with complementary skills working toward a shared goal. As we walked to our cars after dinner, Sophia stopped and turned to face me under a streetlight that cast warm circles on the pavement between us. "I need to tell you something," she said, and for a moment, I felt the old familiar anxiety flutter in my chest. "I've been bragging about you at work, about the store, about your success, about how smart and talented you are. I know it's probably too little too late, but I wanted you to know that I'm proud of you. I'm proud to be your daughter." The words hit me with unexpected force, bringing tears I thought I had finished crying months ago when I finally learned to value my own opinion more than anyone else's. But hearing pride in Sophia's voice, genuine, unforced pride in who I was and what I had accomplished, felt like finally receiving a gift I had stopped hoping for. "Thank you," I said simply, because sometimes the most profound emotions require the simplest responses. 6 months later, our online store was generating more revenue than the physical location. Sophia had moved back to town and was working for me full-time, applying her marketing expertise to building a brand that honored the stories behind our inventory, while reaching customers across the country. We had been featured in 3 national publications and had a waiting list of people hoping to consign their estate pieces through our authentication service. But more importantly than any business success, I had regained my daughter. Not the version of her who needed me to be small so she could feel big, but a woman who had learned to appreciate strength wherever she found it, including in the mother who had taught her everything she knew about resilience and determination. The day we celebrated our first year in business, a milestone Sophia insisted on commemorating with champagne and flowers, and a celebration that included everyone who had supported our journey, I looked around my thriving store and felt a contentment I had never experienced during all those years of living for other people's approval. Eleanor was there, along with Mrs. Chen and Robert and Jennifer with her now walking toddler, and dozens of customers who had become friends over months of conversations about beauty and history, and the stories that objects carry from one generation to the next. Sophia stood at my side as I cut the anniversary ribbon, both of us laughing as customers applauded and cameras flashed. In the photos from that day, we looked like what we had finally become: 2 successful businesswomen, mother and daughter, partners in something meaningful that we had built together. Later, when everyone had gone home and we were cleaning up the celebration debris, Sophia found the framed photo from her college graduation, the one I had stared at for so many months, trying to understand when everything had gone wrong between us. "I want to replace this," she said, holding up the old picture, "with one from today. I like who we are now better than who we were then." As I locked the door that night, I realized I had learned the most important lesson of my 56 years. Sometimes the people we love most have to lose us before they can learn to value us. Sometimes we have to stop seeking approval before we can become worthy of respect. Sometimes the best gift we can give our children is the example of a woman who refuses to apologize for taking up space in the world. I had built something beautiful, not despite my daughter's doubts, but because I had learned to believe in myself even when she didn't. And in the end, that faith had been strong enough to carry us both toward something better than either of us had imagined possible. It wasn't revenge, it was justice. The quiet, powerful justice that comes when women finally realize their own worth and refuse to accept anything less from the people who claim to love them.